All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. On behalf of all of us behind the scenes here at Force, welcome in person or via Zoom to this afternoon's panel discussion, Will Technology Save Us? Prospects for Effective and Equitable Responses to the Climate Crisis. We are coming to you live from Concordia University's Force, located on unceded Indigenous lands in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. As caretakers for the lands and waters we are meeting on, we are grateful to the Ganagahagan Nation for their teachings about the earth and our relations. At Force, we work to connect people to the initiatives, research projects, and dialogues happening across the university. So we are pleased to have the opportunity to collaborate with Damon Matthews on this panel exploring effective responses to climate change. We are running this as a webinar, so we welcome your comments via the Q&A. It's now my pleasure to pass it over to you, Damon. Welcome.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you for being here. Those of you who are in person, thank you for joining us. Those of you who are on Zoom, we can't see you, unfortunately, but I trust that you can see and hear us, and I will be very happy to field your questions either via the Q&A or the chat. So we're going to get started. We have one panelist who is rushing from another event and is apparently minutes away and will join us elegantly, I'm sure, in a few moments. For the moment, I'll introduce the two panelists you see beside me. So David Keith, who has joined us today by virtue of receiving an honorary doctorate from Concordia a couple of hours ago, and lives in Canmore and teaches in Harvard, which is a trick that I haven't quite figured out how you manage yet, but welcome. So he's formerly the Gordon McKay Professor of Applied Physics at Harvard, also the co-host of a very well-known podcast, Energy versus Climate, which I would encourage anyone to check out if they haven't already after this event. Next to David, we have Laure Varidel, long time, very well-known environmentalist, eco-sociologue, writer, social commentator, one-time co-founder of Equitable in Montreal, currently a professor at UQAM and a writer for the Journal de Montréal. And I am very happy to report that our third panelist has just arrived in excellent time, Eliane Ubali-Joho, Executive Director of Sustainability in the Digital Age and Global Hub Director for Future Earth Canada, based here in Montreal, and a colleague that I've had a great pleasure of working with over the last couple of years. So welcome all of you, and thank you again for being here. So the topic of today's panel, climate change is clearly a problem that demands far more effort than it has been given to date. As of this month, I think we're at about 1.25 degrees of human-induced global warming. We are on track for 1.5 degrees at current pace within the decade, likely before 2035. Current emissions trajectories and pledges that are on the table would take us beyond 3 degrees by the end of the century. So, there is obviously progress, and I think we will speak to that as well. More and more countries and corporations are setting ambitious targets, often now phrased as net zero targets. Currently, though, really without the policies in place to achieve them. If you add up all of the policies or all of the targets that are on the table and imagine that the world were to meet them all, we might stay below 2 degrees this century. But we're not there in terms of what is projected based on current policies, and 2 degrees is also not formally within the range of the 1.5 to well below 2 degree target of the Paris Agreement. So there is still work to be done. The world as a whole, and Canada in particular, is not on track to meet the Paris Agreement goals. And we continue to really dance around the solutions that are available to us as a country and as a world without really applying them to their full extent. And so this is the tee up to this panel today. What will it take to accelerate progress? Is technology the answer? Is it something else? What are the best prospects, do you think, for effective and equitable responses to the climate crisis? And so I'll put this question to you as the opener. You're welcome to answer it however you would like. I think we'll start with David as the guest from out of town, and we'll move along the table in this direction.
Sure. Thank you very much. And thank you very much. And thanks for organizing. Yes. So will technology save us? That's an easy one. No. I think maybe a more nuanced answer is technology is, of course, in a deep sense, the cause of all the problems we have, but also of lots of solutions to those problems. So the whole reason that humanity expanded so suddenly over continents and expanded in numbers and wealth was technology, from discovering agriculture or innovating agriculture to the discovery of access to fossil fuels. All sorts of changes have enabled this extraordinary change in our society, and technology has been at the center of that, and so is in a very real sense the center of all these problems we're discussing. But it's also true that there's no way you're going to eliminate emissions without some technology other than by eliminating all the people. And I think what often happens in conversations like this is people use the word technology to mean the thing they don't like, as distinct from some other thing that they do like that they don't call technology. And at least for me, I think of technology as application of tools by humans, which includes a big range of things, including tools that indigenous communities used over tens of thousands of years were evolved technologies with great complexity in some cases. So we're certainly going to need I think we're certainly going to need solar power by almost any version of the way we solve climate or reduce emissions. And that is a very high and specialized and complicated technology. So there's a way in which I think the real nuanced answer is technology is both a driver of these problems, but of course, if we do get to a world where we've eliminated emissions, technology is part of that. But I think the central answer is technology is not an actor. Technology does not do something, we do something. And I think asking the question that way really abstracts from what the problem is. The problem is that in order to decarbonize quickly, to reduce climate risks, people, and often the richer and more powerful people in our societies, have to give up some of what they have. The world as we know it now has to change economically and politically in order to drive emissions down. And that means a social conflict between people who want to see emissions cut more, as I do, as I'm sure our whole panel does, and people who may be good enough people, but who are really prefer the status quo the way it is. And that involves a social conflict. And so I think there's no way that we don't solve the climate problem without a central role for social activism in driving these changes. So I think you can't separate the two. And there's nothing new about this for climate. This is true when you look back for almost any of the big environmental problems we have at least partially dealt with. So we've made enormous problems in getting to cleaner air in much of the rich world, and not just the rich world now. Lots of other environmental problems we've made real improvements on, and all those required both social movements, battles with the status quo, and also new technologies. But the new technologies didn't solve the problem. And new technologies came because they were demanded, pushed. I guess I'd like to close by saying one thing, which is just to speculate and hear what other people think about where we are now in the discussion about climate. So I've worked on climate now for over 30 years. It's really been my whole career. I haven't done almost anything else. And I do think, I used to give talks 10 years ago saying it was a total phony war and that people were talking about climate but doing nothing. I can't quite say that anymore. We're doing a lot less than I think we should be doing. If I was a voter, I would vote to do much more. But we're now spending something like $500-600 billion a year globally on clean energy. And that's, maybe a third of what I think would be the right number to really drive emissions down. Emissions in all of North America and Europe are going down, nowhere near as fast as they should, but they are. And so it feels it's like a sort of slightly different world. We're still doing much less than would be, certainly much less than we need to meet Paris, much less than I would vote for as a voter, but it's not quite true to say we're doing nothing. And in the last few years, climate really has risen to near the top of the political agenda in a way that really wasn't true before, and it's very exciting. So to me, we're in this middle world where the question is, what happens next?
Yeah, thanks, David. I mean, it was kind of remarkable at the last COP, I thought, that I found myself agreeing with almost everything that was being said by the delegates there, which is actually a pretty significant departure from some previous meetings. So yeah, we are starting to acknowledge the problem more, and that is step one of moving towards this solution. So Loch, yes, why don't you go ahead?
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation, and I'm very happy to be with all of you. So what I have to say, well, my simple answer is the same as you. Of course, no, technology is not going to save the world, and yes, I believe that it's people that will make the necessary changes. And I personally started to be involved on environmental issues in 1988, so 33 years ago, and already at that time, people were saying, well, you know, don't worry too much. We're gonna find technological solution, not only to reduce, to be able to produce energy with a lower impact, but also we're going to find the technologies that are going to eat up the pollution almost. And what happened since then? Yes, green tech have exploded, and it's amazing to see how much more solar energy we produce, and wind turbine, and we have more electric car and everything. But despite all those great technology, when you look at the rise of production and consumption of fossil fuel, it still has increased. So it's not like if it has replaced the polluting sources of energy, it just has add up to it, creating, so not responding to the art of the problem. And I think that's a fundamental challenge that we are facing. And so now let's talk about the technology that could absorb a greenhouse gas emission and other things. I would love that so much. You know, when I listen to some politicians and even some that are presenting themselves as green politicians, but that believe very strongly in technology, you know, it would be so easy. Like, for example, I love traveling, taking planes, and I almost don't do it anymore. But you know, everybody would feel like, you know, so nice. We don't have to change our way of life, and we keep consuming and we keep doing those things. But we were talking about those technology 30 years ago, and still it's not there. And what, you know, still the best technology we have is trees and plants and photosynthesis. We haven't found something greater than that, to my knowledge, to absorb CO2. So I think that the hope of finding green tech that would save us is in fact preventing us from taking effective action that we already know that must be taken, but that means change that we need to undergo right now to address the source of the problem. And I think that that's what's happening with the development of green tech, is that we are deviating from addressing the real problem, and the cause of this is the way we produce, consume, and live on this planet, and how humans have been started, you know, taking all the places. And so to me, the debate around the technology as the key solution, the image that comes to my mind is kind of a bath that is overflowing, you know, a bit like if they, you know, seeing it as the atmosphere, that we know that there's too much green gas there, and it's creating damage, and rather than just, you know, turning off the tap, we're trying to work on new way to how to say that, to take the water, to mop the water on the floor, and new kind of you know, cloth, and new sorts of spoon. But we know that we have to stop burning fossil fuel. We know that we have to eat differently with less meat. We know that overall we need to consume less, and this resistance to change, because it addresses too many what we are, because our society is so much based on consumption, and our economy is dependent on that. So we're not having the courage to really address the need of material degrowth and other ways of living on this planet. We have big challenges at reflecting on needs versus want, and to have a real discussion about the economic growth, because when you look both at sources of climate and environmental crisis and also the rise of inequity, we necessarily go on discussion about the economic system and the way it externalizes environmental and social costs. And this needs to be addressed, and this has to be addressed by the states, by public policy, but public policies are not going to change if people are not pushing for change, because there's a huge resistance to change. So social mobilization, to me, is really a key element for addressing the climate crisis, and more generally the various social and environmental crises that we are facing and that are growing recently. So I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
No, thank you. So that's two votes for social mobilization. So I'm glad to hear that. Eliane, do you want to jump in?
Yes. So I want to go contrarian here and say, yes, technology is going to save us, but inclusive technology is good. And so what we need is our technologies that work with nature, that work with all communities in the world to decrease inequities and use the power of nature to move us forward. So clearly, we know that we need to stop the addiction to oil and gas around the world. And so one of the realities we have is we currently still have high levels of financing of these industries that are continuing to pollute in the world. And so what we really need is just a ban on any new investment in polluting energy systems. And what we also need is creativity, more creativity around how do we accelerate the energy sources that can power the world in ways that are sustainable, in ways that work with the amazing creativity of nature, the power of the sun, and other ways we can move forward. And so the reality is technology can work for us in the direction we need to go in the time we have, but we need collective action. So I do agree around the critical importance of social movement and how we collectively work together. Last week, I was in Davos, and someone said that it's not a climate crisis, it's a communication crisis. And it's a communication crisis in that where we are today, if every single person voted towards the most ambitious climate policies in the world, our policymakers would have no choice but present solutions that are going in that direction. So how come we're not moving there? And so there's the issue of how many of us really believe in climate change. We're not at a place where we can say everybody on this planet believes in climate change, sadly. And so one of the things we have to realize is that as scientists, we really need to accelerate how every single person on the planet understands the urgency of the agenda we're facing and understands the power they have in how they vote. I just think in Canada, we usually have about 40% of the population that doesn't vote. That percent of the population could get the Green Party elected if they just decided tomorrow to all go out and vote. And so part of it, I think, is really critical, is we can bring up all the data we want as scientists, as long as business and policymaker isn't working in the direction we want, which is let's stop financing solutions that are scaling and accelerating pollution and greenhouse gas emissions on the planet, and let's go from extractive economies to regenerative economies where everything we're doing is circular and is regenerative, then we really have a chance of getting where we can get. And so some people say what we're really facing is an issue of empathy, because for a lot of people, there's still this feeling that, oh, it's gonna happen elsewhere. However, when we look at the fires that happen in British Columbia, what we're realizing is these spikes, these disasters climatically are happening all over the world without discrimination. But clearly, if you are in an island state, or if you are in Bangladesh and some places in the world that are extremely vulnerable, you are facing those rates of change as an accelerated way. I think of Chad. The River Chad, 30 years ago, was 10 times larger than it is today. In that same period of time, the population has grown 10 times. So the pressure on the resources are accelerating at a rate that is just immense. I think of the latest IPCC report on Africa. Africa's population is set to double between now and 2050. So that's 2.6 billion people by 2050, 40% of the population of the planet. And in the last 50 years, agricultural production, because of climate, has decreased by 30%. Soil degradation is also decreasing agricultural productivity. So if we think about regeneration and regenerative economies and regenerative soils that increase the health and fertility of the soils, what are we having in the world? Climate incidents, flooding, droughts. Healthy soils are able to absorb more water, retain more water, and be more resilient. So how we address basic things as our relationship with soil and stop looking at nature as a mechanical system, but as a living biological complex system that it is. And we work with that complexity in how we use and engage with technology, we can collectively get where we need to go. We can all imagine a beautiful world where all our energy sources are renewable, where all economies are circular, and all activities take into account natural capital, human capital, and social capital, and where there are no inequities and everybody can have a decent, respectful livelihood. We can all imagine that. So now it's really about, can we go from thinking that that is Pollyannish to putting that into policy, to putting that into measures that determine what the big banks in the world are going to use in terms of determining who gets loans, how companies get rated on stock markets? How do we change the whole system to make it reflect our capacity to promote regeneration? And in that sense, we can really have technology power us where we need to get.
Well, so many interesting thoughts. I hardly even know where to where to start. And maybe I'll pick up on something you just brought up, this idea of a communication crisis, and that we don't, as a world, we haven't like really embraced this problem. I think. I mean, certainly certain people have, but I mean, David, I'm interested in your reflections living in Alberta. We were talking about this on the way over. To what extent is public opinion changing, do you think? And how can we move that needle so that the federal government has a clear license to be more ambitious?
I'm skeptical. I think communications is part of it, but I think it's more a crisis of power and legitimacy than communication. Maybe I'm going to pick up on a couple of things. I think it is correct that a lot of what's happened in the last decades with the growth of solar and wind is that we've grown those, but we haven't decreased fossil. And I think fundamental to that is governments getting serious about penalizing the use of the atmosphere as a waste dump. I think that really is central to dealing with the problem. I do think it's worth, I think in a sense what you're hearing is different theories of the problem. I mean, to slightly characterize, Laura is saying that, or said that one of the reasons for inaction is the green tech is preventing this chimera that will have a magic cheap solution, and so that's preventing us actually acting. I'm skeptical it plays that much of a role. The green tech you're talking about is less than 1% of all the money we're spending. I mean, that's 600 billion, basically nothing is going to green tech you're talking about. It's going mostly to the stuff you and I would probably agree about, solar and wind. And I think the reason that many of our fellow citizens and big institutions are fighting action is not because there might be some green tech someday, it's because their interests are threatened.
Both. Can I reply? I agree their interests are, but there's this resistance to change in general, that it's easier to think, well, some people are going to solve it when we happen to it. And the reason why I say that is that I'm now very involved with a movement called Mère au Front. So it's mother from all walk of life that get involved and go to meet politicians. And we got pretty good discussion with some of them, and something that talking with them in politicians in Quebec, but also some representative at the federal government also, it is the fact that although they know science, although they're aware of the threat, the political cost of really pushing for a real solution that would address the issue of overconsumption, of urban sprawl, and all those things, they perceive it as too high of political costs. So it's easier to say, eventually we'll finance, and I mean, the federal have been doing that, financing a lot of new research in technology and all this, but not addressing the real issue. So it's not necessarily in terms of financing green tech or not financing green tech. That's not really the issue. It's your view of the future and your view of, human, when they're really faced to a real danger, they find the solution. And then they give you the example of COVID, the threat was there. And so we united, and yes, we found a solution to find a vaccine and all this. But I think that the problem is much more complex with climate and with the environmental crisis in general, because we talk a lot more about climate than biodiversity loss and pollution in general. But it's the full system that needs to be rethinked. And I agree with you about the relationship, because we are on a very predator kind of approach, that we kind of eat up everything and we don't care about the rest. And so the need of creating a more empathic reflex we need a switch of paradigms that will change our value, that will change what are the priority. We prioritize economic growth, or do we prioritize, the well-being of our kids and their future and the quality of life, and look at the world differently and rethink wealth? I think we really need to address this situation, because the way the world works, wealth is money. But when if I ask you the question, what is your main source of, what is your more cherished, or what is more precious, or what, for you? Well, you don't have to answer, and you neither. But I mean, most people, when I ask the question in conference, they will talk about their kids, they will talk about their family, they will talk about relationship, health, democracy, and things like that. Whereas all those elements are not calculated in the GDP, which is what we use to make decisions collectively. So that's where, and I think the idea of technology is that you can invest a lot of money and you keep being in that model and pattern of economic growth, even if you don't rethink the way we interact, that relationship with each other and with the planet.
I'd like to add that I think there's the critical importance. I really love what you said around power structures, the need to change the power dynamics in the world. Mm-hmm. So I was having some fun looking at how much many industrialized countries put in the military versus climate change. And the 10x easy factor in between, mm-hmm. and thinking, how do we change those priorities in terms of our engagement, a shared value system of how do we take care of our planet? So here we are in the last 2 years. We've had the pandemic, we've had a social justice crisis, now we have a war that is affecting food security and energy around the whole planet. And so the reality of how we are living humanity, our interconnectedness is broken. And I see an interrelationship between soil degradation around the world. A third of soils around the world are degrading, in Africa in particular, 65%. And the interconnection of humanity is degraded. How can we, in the middle of a pandemic, go through such a crisis in terms of social justice movement, and people in the middle of the pandemic, just come out on the streets knowing the risks they're taking to their health, and then have a war that is affecting the whole planet in so many different ways? Ukraine had one of the seed banks of the planet that has been partially destroyed with what is happening. So we think of the seeds of the planet, we have about 7,000 varieties of seeds. We only really consume more than 5 or 6. But the reality is how we preserve that biodiversity that is critical to feeding humanity is really important. And every time there's a war someplace and those seed banks get destroyed, that's a loss in terms of future generations having access to nutritious foods. And so what matters in terms of power, in terms of the structures that are in place, in terms of the values that are determining how we are rating the investments we're making, war versus climate versus social justice, are critical. And it's really important for me because when I think for the last year, we've had at Sustainability in the Digital Age and Future Earth, we held a national dialogue series bringing Canadians together to think about the Sustainable Development Goals in terms of education and partnerships and Indigenous knowledge and science. And what was interesting is when we started the series, the data was saying that less than a quarter of Canadians knew what the Sustainable Development Goals were. And so the urgency for 2030, all of us are like, yeah, 2030. But most people have no idea why the hell we're talking about 2030. And so this is why I really think that engagement that scientists have with citizens has to be strengthened. And I think the movement through mothers, I think that is so, so beautiful. It makes me think of another initiative called Daughters of the Earth coming together to fight for Mother Earth. And it's really about how do we prioritize fighting, or maybe the word fighting is not appropriate, but engaging in action and impact for the planet, for an interconnectedness versus profit, short-term profit maximization. And so this is the paradigm shift that needs to happen. I'm hopeful because of institutions like the International Sustainability Standards Board that's been put in place in terms of the new accounting legislation that is forcing climate accounting to happen in a few countries, and hopefully that will spread all over the world. But bringing that level of awareness and consciousness of the private sector to say, how are we contributing positively or negatively to natural capital, and putting that in ledgers so people can know and see it, I think is going to be the beginning of a shift. How fast that shift is going to happen for us to get where we need to get, that's where we need the social movement. That's where we need more literacy around climate and more collective engagement, and also more work at the interface of science and the arts to really get this message to pass across. I think, some of you may have seen the movie that came out during the holidays with
Don't Look Up?
Yeah, Don't Look Up, which was, some found it hilarious, some thought it was terrible cinematographically. But this idea of how we can live at a level of denial is a critical element that we need to face. And this is one of the things also I feel, it's like in our technological age, it's also time to reconnect with the wisdom of our ancestors, the wisdom of indigenous populations, and connect the acceleration of technology with the acceleration of wisdom, and wisdom guiding how we use technology to move forward.
To make a plea for simplicity, I understand, well, there's a lot of reasons why financial institutions and governments are moving towards different climate accounting standards. Part of it is actually an intuitive, healthy idea that we'd sort of like to know our environmental footprints. It turns out to be extraordinarily hard to know them. And my view is this is actually part of a evolving and maybe partly deliberate confusion that avoids the simplicity of the real issue. Climate is almost completely driven by fossil fuels. We already regulate where fossil fuels enter our economy. We know it clearly. It's extraordinarily easy to devise regulations that would put a high price or restriction on fossil emissions. This idea that we're going to do this by complicated carbon offset protocols or by Wall Street finding a way to do accounting, to give you a sense of how hard this is, even if you have no financial incentive to twist the answer, if you're just honestly trying to figure out what is the life cycle carbon impact of a company, it's actually very hard to do. It's uncertain to factors of like 50% easily. I think there's no need to do that. I think regulation works when it's simple, because there's always less regulators than there are people, companies out there. And I think we are sometimes, in all the confusion of talking about how big and interconnected a problem is, losing track of, in some sense, the simplicity of the climate problem. Fundamentally, it's about reducing fossil fuel use. We need to find cost-effective ways to do that. We have lots of cost-effective ways that we are not implementing. And instead, we are using a bunch of policies that are kind of feel-good policies that are not spending the resources we have to drive emissions down quickly in ways we know how to do.
Turning off the tab. Whatever was meaning.
I mean, it comes back to my initial statement around the first thing we need to do is stop all investment in fossil fuels.
Not in the world. So I think it's easy to say that, but who's going to do it and who's going to enforce it? I think we need to put a hard limits and declining limits on emissions. Investment is really different from emissions. And remember that as much as fossil fuels are the problem, if we don't have access to fossil fuels instantly, we have shocks where people die. So literally, if you actually had a no investment rule and there's some cold place that has a gas supply system, say for winter heating, that breaks, then you're not allowed to fix it. So I think again, why go to complex rules like that? Why not just put a simple rule that forces with high penalties for non-compliance us to emit less fossil fuel, to use less fossil fuels? That's very different from an investment. And also, I think it's important to say there are some people in the world, the poorest 1.5 billion, who are living primarily on solid cooking fuels, who I think in the near term actually should get more LPG, especially women cooking, because it has a huge health benefit and very little environmental harm. At the same time, that's the part of the great social injustice. We in the rich world should be spending much more money to drive our emissions down fast, but I wouldn't support a global ban that says you're not allowed to spend a cent on new fossil fuel investment. It sounds good, but I don't think it's a just or effective answer.
I just don't think right now we're actually investing in the marginalized populations that need help, and the new investments are happening in explorations to just feed our current economy. And it's that transformation and that regulation, it's sort of like, well, who does it? Who leads? How do we get it done? And so this is why it comes back to, as citizens, if we all voted for the most rigorous climate policies, while also ensuring that we have social justice and equity to ensure sustainable livelihoods for all, then we can have a collective system where we move forward. But we are in a country where we have a strong political party that practically is denying climate change. Mm-hmm. And so how do we move forward with strong regulation when that basic governance space, we can't have the needed level of coalition that is needed to move forward? And so this is even as simple as it is how do we get to that level of simplicity? And that's the hard part.
And how to implement it concretely. Because ideally, every politician, but also every business person, every individual should pass every decision to the how do you say, crible, tamis, of the environmental and social justice impact. If we were doing that, then every decision, the small one and the big one, would be very different, and it would impose a vision that is more long-term than just the short-term economic benefit. But we're far from there. But I think that policymakers have a role to play for that.
Again, I'm going to plead for simplicity. I think human brains are limited, and there are a huge number of problems. Climate is the biggest global environmental problem, but there are many other environmental problems. Taking land from nature, soil degradation, there are a huge host of social problems. I don't think it works to have everybody think about every problem and every decision. I think that is actually, to be really critical, a kind of fuzziness that is an easy way to avoid anybody doing anything. I think if you look at problems we've really made progress on before, we didn't do it by saying everybody thinks about everything. We did it by really, if you think about the way we've regulated reduction of toxic metals or of CFCs, of lead in gasoline, of the air pollution that's added now 2 years to the lives of average North Americans. We did it by pretty simple rules that focused on the polluting toxins and said you're not allowed to do them anymore.
To me, my vision of having this filter is pretty simple. And as long as we don't do it, things will not happen, because it's just go from little piece to little piece. Whereas saying, okay, is it more core? If I have choice between having the water like this or the bottle should just not be allowed to be sold, and we should just have this solution being taken in place. But as long as we don't have the courage to do that, then we just putting the problem, for the others, and later on we need to start addressing the real question. And the very simple thing is that we need to reduce consumption overall, and we're not in that framework of reducing because of our economic model of growth. So but I think that solutions are a bit everywhere, but what is clear to me is that we need to have a switch of paradigms and review our priority and our choices, collective and individual, because individual choices are not enough.
Maybe, I mean, I think it is one of the things about many solutions. I mean, people often ask, what's the best solution? And I think you can pick almost anything, and if you make it work well, it will be part of the solution to this particular problem. I did want to I think I would be remiss, David, if I didn't ask you about carbon removal, because you do come with some expertise on this topic, and we've sort of touched on it in a couple of places, whether it's trees or technology. But what do you think is the role of carbon removal in this problem?
So it is true that, I mean, the single most important thing to know about climate change, I guess, is that technically, is that it's a cumulative problem. So that the day that we bring emissions to zero, the problem doesn't stop, it just stops getting worse. And so it is literally true that if we want to, after we've reduced emissions, if we want to reduce this long-term climate risk, we do need to do carbon removal. I think that there's no question the near-term focus should be overwhelmingly on cutting emissions, not on carbon removal. But I do think carbon removal does do something that cutting emissions doesn't do. And it's something that we might and I think I would vote to do in the long run, because it would be cleaning it up, and cutting emissions simply doesn't do that. And I don't believe that trees do it. I think the original IPCC accounting rules and the core of papers you and I have worked on are that the natural ecosystem is counted, and I think should be counted as part of the carbon cycle, part of the interaction. The climate problem is driven by moving fossil fuels from the geosphere to the active biosphere, where then they can equilibrate between the ocean, the land, and the surface biosphere. And so when you plant trees, you may pull some carbon out of the atmosphere for a while, but the trees have short lifetime, it goes back in. That equilibration depends on future climate change and the future choices we make. So I think the right thing is to count them as part of the natural part of the carbon cycle and different from permanent removals. So if we add alkalinity to the ocean, which is weathering, the long-term process, or if we take carbon that was in the atmosphere and put it underground, then we really have, in a sense, reversed the kind of geochemical process that caused climate change. And I do think those are things we might want to do in the long run. And I think happy to hear disagreement, but it feels to me pretty climate 101 basic that trees don't do that.
Well, when I mention trees and planting trees, it's part of the solution that have been put forward, and that's probably the reason why the federal government announced this big. It's just that I haven't seen so far better technology than trees to cap carbon. But you're right that when the carbon is there, it's there and it can be burned and it can be. But I'm not an expert on that. I was mentioning it as other things, so I have my confidence.
The profound reason why trees seem so good, which is the reason that Trump supported it, is it is easy, almost impossible to check, and it allows industries and governments to say they're doing something when they're not. That's why it gets a lot of traction. That's why Trump supported it. That's why I can fly Delta Airlines and it says it's carbon neutral. The problem is we're tolerating the lie.
Yeah, that I agree.
I mean, it's such an interesting problem, because there are so many good reasons to plant trees.
Absolutely.
Right? And there's so many good reasons to preserve nature, to work better with natural systems. But
that's a different thing. I mean,
it is.
Forgetting the social part of Alberta, but speaking as somebody who lives in the Intermountain West, we've done a lot of fire suppression. There's more biosphere and more trees living longer, with now changing the ecology because of fire suppression. So people somehow have the idea that more carbon biomass is not necessarily better for nature, but that's not, we could plant a lot of trees by running, and people have suggested this, nuclear reactors along the coast of the Sahara and filling it with desalinated water and planting a huge amount of trees. It would work, it'd remove a lot of carbon, but that wouldn't be protecting nature. It would be a desecration of the beautiful desert. And you can, by fire suppression and other tree planting, add to the biomass of Western North America, but that's not making it more natural, it's making it less natural. My friends in Canmore who fight for Yellowstone to Yukon don't want that. We should let nature be what it is and deal with our own problems. Humans have caused carbon to go into the atmosphere, we need to deal with that, not pretend that nature is somehow going to be bent to our will.
No, I mean, carbon is, one of the co-benefits of changing that relationship with nature. And it is very telling that the conservative climate platform in the last election was the only one that mentioned nature-based solutions as a key feature, right? Because it can be a distraction. It can be, but at the same time, it's such a, if you think of the environmental challenges writ large, biodiversity is so critical, and so much of that is about the right relationship with land. Right?
I think it goes back, and maybe sorry, I'll say something deliberately provocative and give you. It goes back to some part of the environmental movement that really thinks that if we had a lot less technology, we'd have less impact. And I think the problem is, in a world with 7 billion people, I believe it's the opposite of that. That if we really live with much less technology, we'd have more impact because we'd have to clear much more land for farming. We'd have to do things in more destructive ways. The only reason that we've been able to have the impact we have with 7 billion people is technology that's reduced the impact per unit.
Yeah, but I think we need less of everything in general. That's the key of the problem. And yes, there's also the issue of a human population that is very difficult to discuss ethically. But when you look at the data, of course, every human that has an ecological footprint. But regarding the forest and the wood, although I understand what you say about the trees, but still, if we were using more tree like in buildings, for example, rather than cements, and it's just that I think that for me, that's part of the solution. Again, it's not like one solution. The same way that green tech is not the solution, it can be part of the solution. Planting trees for me is clearly part of the solution. Also, for biodiversity reason, for temperature reason, for health reason in our cities. So there's, as you mentioned, all those benefits. But I think we something we need to do is to work more together in complementarity, and that's something I see a lot in the environmental movement, how good we are at saying, no, it's not this, it's that, and then fighting about, what is the best solution, whereas it's, all those elements together that needs to be kind of discussed and put in place in different circumstances, and taking into account the cultural reality. When you talk about with indigenous people about meat eating, then it's a totally different discussion than when you talk about meat eating with a farmer that is raising lamb or whatever. So when we talk about how do you say that in English? Well, in French it's complex problem, but wicked problems. I think we're really in a good example of that.
So I'm a champion of the Coalition for Digital Environmental Sustainability with the UN Tech Envoy's office, and UNEP, UNDP, the German Environment Agency, International Science Council, and the Kenyan Ministry of Environment. And just this week at Stockholm Plus 50, we just launched our action plan. And what we say is we need, there's shifts we need to have. We need to stop doing the bad stuff. We need to ensure that our technology is sustainable and that is circular in terms of we're going to use more of it, there's no choice about it, but how do we ensure that as we use it, we also think about the circularity and the energy resources that pertain to using it? And we need to have transformative solutions that are going to be multi-layer. We're going to need carbon capture. We're going to need to plant trees. We're going to need to keep the trees that are in the ground there. We have to make sure we're keeping the irrecoverable carbon in the ground. And it's how do we collectively allow those three shifts to happen? And how do we put in place action plans to accelerate those shifts is what is needed right now.
But I think a reflection about reducing in general and the way we live is fundamental, and a reflection between what we really need and what we want, because we cannot respond positively to more wants of everyone, and we cannot all live like we live here in rich countries. So I think rich countries have to live in different way, and so that poorer people can raise their level of life. But that means sharing. That means working on the heart, not only the head. So empathy is key.
I'm really glad you said that last part about rich people having more, because I do think that, I mean, first of all, actually on buildings and wood buildings, I completely agree with you. That's a really interesting and important thing, that we can build high wood buildings in a way that's much better than concrete. But I think that those of us in the rich world can clearly make some consumption choices, less flying, less meat eating, that would take a bite out of the problem. But remember, we need to bring emissions to zero. We're not going to bring consumption to zero. So most of this is about changing the energy system. But I do think we have to be cautious about sitting in a rich country, in a rich city, and talking about less of everything. Just before COVID, I spent time in Bangladesh, going down to the Delta region, talking with some individual farmers there. And we were in the cities where there's really some climate refugees. And obviously, I don't wish those people had less of everything. I wish they had more of everything.
Of course, I agree.
And I think we need to really, and I think if they're going to have more of everything, they need to do it with technologies that have less impact.
Yeah, of course. It's not starting like we did and then trying to reduce. That's for sure.
Maybe we'll take a question from the audience. There's so Camille has her hand raised on the Zoom. Are you able to speak, Camille?
Yeah.
Good, we can hear you.
Oh, great. So I raised my hand a while ago, so I don't know if I remember everything I wanted to say. I think, first of all, regarding the use of technology in rich countries, we are totally underestimating the rebound effect, the Jevons paradox. Clearly a link between the more I enhance my technological abilities, the more I'm going to use it as a society, and then I'm totally compensating the environmental benefits of it because I use it too much. And that's something we're not able to calculate or estimate in a good way. I think the problem with sustainable technology is we're not able to assess in a reliable way how technology is going to be sustainable in a quantitative way. And so we're kind of blind here to say, okay, it's going to be better or worse. And I think the third thing I wanted to say is we are underestimating the shift in the impacts we are producing. Most of the time, when we change the way we are doing things, we stop some impacts, but we are creating others in other places that we are not able to assess again. And so most of the time we have those huge shifts in impacts that we are not taking into account because we are very much concentrating ourselves on climate change and nothing else. And so I think that's a little bit dangerous. So yeah, that was my idea.
Yeah. Okay, great. So yeah, a few interesting points there. One, this idea of the rebound effect. You know, if you get a new technology and it's so much better, you use it so much more, and your net environmental impact doesn't change. And then this idea of shifting impacts, and yes, we could solve the climate problem in theory just by outsourcing the environmental impact to other places. You know, if we stopped using cement and only used wood, for example, we would have to cut down a lot more forests. That would just be displacing impacts to biodiversity and ecological systems. So yeah, I mean, any thoughts on either of those two challenges?
Well, I think it's really critical that we look at climate and biodiversity together. The interconnectedness, I know I'm going back to that, but it's really about, it's a complex system. Yes, it'd be great to be able to have simplified solutions, but I really think because of the complexity we have to deal with, we have to figure out how do we get insights out of all the data we have, and how do we do it in ways that are going to ensure that we find ways to solve the climate crisis while we're also bending back in terms of biodiversity, bringing back biodiversity. The two have to come together. And so I think of agriculture, where 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions are coming from agriculture. If we went completely regenerative in agriculture and able to feed the planet in ways that are nature positive, then we have food security, while at the same time we're using less soils and polluting, well, eliminating pollution that we're putting in terms of chemical pesticides, fertilizers, herbicides on our soils. And so how do we make everything we look at from a regenerative mindset? And so how do we bring that way of thinking in how we educate children? We know we have an education system that comes from the 19th century. And so there's a revamping that we need to do at that level. And Damon, with your LEADS program, you're doing amazing work in terms of training the next generation of leaders at the interface of sustainability and digitalization. And so it's how do we take the complexity that we have to face into account? And I love talking about the VUCA world. Some of you have heard me talking about that a lot. And it's this idea that we live in a volatile, ambiguous, uncertain, complex world, and that we need to flip the VUCA, so the volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, to vision, understanding, clarity, and agility. And how do we have that flipped leadership in everything that we do to address the complexity of the interconnected problems that we're facing? And so it's really that capacity of being able to look at our problems, not from a linear perspective, but from an interconnected perspective. And that also aligns with a lot of Indigenous ways of knowing and thinking and doing that really see ourselves as part of a larger web, and that nothing we do can have no consequences on other things. And so how we move this type of thinking forward is critical to transform the extractive relationship we've had with the planet for centuries.
Yeah, I agree.
Two comments. One on Jevons or rebound. I think there's a big difference between energy efficiency, the use side, and energy supply. So if you build a much more energy efficient light bulb, as we've done with LED bulbs, or a much more energy efficient vehicle, there's obvious rebounds because things get cheaper. You can use them more. But if what you do is replace the current fossil fuel primary energy supply with a decarbonized energy supply where that energy will cost more, then I think there's much less of a rebound because costs will go up, down through the rest of the economy, and you've actually dealt with the core problem, which was emissions. And I also think, and maybe this is very linear scientific thinking, but I think that sometimes we have too much talk about complexity. And sometimes I think if I was an Exxon lobbyist, I would love us talking about how complex this is. In some ways, this is much less complex than other environmental problems we've dealt with. The air pollution is extraordinarily complex because of the diversity of pollutants, the way they interact. I mean, I'm partly living in atmospheric chemistry department. We've some pollutants like lead we drove down very quickly, but controlling NOx, controlling surface ozone has been very hard because of all the interactions. In some ways, climate isn't very complicated. It's driven by emissions and fossil fuels that come from a limited number of places in our society, and we know how to fix them. And I think actually retreating to the idea that everything's connected and it's all complexity is letting the other side win. The answer here is that we need to make it illegal to use the atmosphere as a waste dump for fossil fuels. We need to transform our bulk energy system to remove the use of fossil fuels. We know the tools to do that. We have to enact the laws to do it.
I agree with that part. Very much so.
It's the how. How do we do it? How do we do it?
So maybe this is where maybe it's that you were saying the same thing. So I agree that politically things are complex in a way they weren't before. We live in a polycentric governance world. I agree with that. So if that's what you mean, then 100% agreement.
But it's also because fossil fuel are everywhere. You know, they're linked to our food system. They're linked to our education system. They're linked to every system. So that's where I think it's. Although the element of solution you brought, I agree with. I think that when it's time to implement it, that's where the challenge is. But that's also why we need to think outside the box so much. And for example, you were talking about regenerative agriculture. That is really key. I agree with that. But something that we need to even reflect on the top of that is how much food we waste. I mean, we waste 30 to 50% of our food production, and then we have the agribusiness saying, "Oh yes, we need to have more GMOs to produce more food and adapt to climate change and everything." But can we just rethink the food system and some way stop wasting so much, for example, and there I agree, we have even technology can help us reduce the waste by knowing better where the food is and how we could recuperate it. So yes, technologies for things like that have a place, a role to play. I think that Norma has a question.
Okay, so let's take one more question. I mean, unfortunately, I should have known we had more than an hour's worth of conversation here, but we do have to wrap up in about 5 minutes. So we'll take your question and then maybe we can have some closing thoughts from the panel.
Just to come back to that simplicity, if there was a text by Vasla Snell recently in the New York Times about the fact that it might look simple, but transforming the energy system is quite a challenge. So, I mean, once you've said that, no, it's simple, we have to ban fossil fuels. If you look, I mean, from the recent text by Václav Smil in the New York Times, it's far from simple. And coming back to the previous question, just this rebound, the fact that when we add energy, it's very hard to really reduce and transform. So how do you see this challenge? Because, I mean, how do you picture this as really a simple problem? I mean, if I look, for example, we need all the steel and cement for at least 1 year, the full production of the whole world, to replace with wind and solar what we're using as oil and gas. But we're using it for other cases also. So those are major challenges.
I love Václav, and he's a wonderful misanthrope. And he's brilliant in helping us understand how the energy system works. But in terms of prescriptions for the future, he's made a niche of giving the most pessimistic outcome, and I don't subscribe. I think we don't know all the way down the road, but we know the first steps on the road very clearly. So we could use much more solar, especially, and long distance transmission. And we could do that in a way that would drive down electricity system emissions and drive up electrification in ways that we know how to do. And I think we have the fundamental tools, we have the technology, we have the supply chain. What we're not doing it is doing enough of it. There are lots of other, go on and on, there are lots of other next steps, but I don't think there's too much mystery about what those steps are in the near term. Maybe I'm not understanding the question, but yeah. I mean, is it true that in building that infrastructure you have some emissions? Yes, but that doesn't mean there's not a huge benefit to building that infrastructure.
I think this particular question we can certainly continue as soon as we wrap up. I want to give everyone maybe 30 seconds for some closing thoughts before we have to. Unfortunately, we have another event starting at 3 in this space, so we're going to have to clear out. Blah, do you want to offer anything in closing?
I just want to go back again on the idea that we need to switch of paradigms in terms of our priorities and values, and focus on the need of reduction. To me, it's key that we need to transform the economy in regard to that, and that touching the art is very important to bring people into change. So yes, we have a lot of content, a lot of understanding, but as long as the art is not touched with something that we feel we need to protect, I think that it's going to be very difficult to have real political changes.
Yeah, Eliane?
I think we need a lot more inclusion in terms of technology and innovation on the planet. I think there's still a lot of people who are excluded. You were talking about being in Bangladesh. I want to see more innovation coming from the most marginalized and fragile places in the world to lead us through this time of crisis. And I also want governance systems that embed what kind of ancestors we want to be in the policies we're putting forward.
And David, maybe I'll give you the last word and then we'll wrap up.
I agree that in the long run, if we don't manage the endless drive to consumption, no amount of technology solves it. And I agree that humans are going to have to deal with the fact that after living in millennia of scarcity, where we thought more stuff would make us happy, and at the beginning it does, that we're at a world where we're saturated. And most of us are not, in the rich world, are not happy with more stuff. And I do think we need that. I also think it's going to be slow. I think that's a social change that's inherently slow, in the same way as you think about the slowness of change in relation to men and women. My mother and and her mother were both pretty active feminists, and there's been lots of change in that time, but I think you would agree it's not all fixed now, right? So I think those processes are slow. Whereas for climate, we really do need to drive emissions down on scale of decades. And I think most of that is just building the hardware to drive emissions down. But I agree that in the long run, we also need to change the way we think about consumption.
All right, thank you, folks. So sorry to bust in on your conversation and have to wrap things up. Obviously, there's so much interest in continuing this, just looking at the Q&A and the chat and the folks in the space with hands raised. So apologies for having to end. But Damon, we appreciate you pulling these folks together. Thank you for organizing this panel. And perhaps there is a part 2 that we can work on developing together. You're more than welcome to stick around for this job info session for economics students that is starting in 15 minutes here in the space, folks. But we do have to say goodbye at this point and welcome our next participant into the space. And those of you who want to revisit this event, I'll mention once again that it has been streamed to Concordia University's 4th Space YouTube channel, so you can check it out there right away and share it across your networks. Thanks, everybody. Until next time.